Welcome to The World We Got This with Esau Williams.
Hello and welcome to this, the first in a new series of podcasts from the School of Global Affairs at King's College London. It's entitled World We Got This podcast, and my name is Esau Williams, and on today's panel I have Frans Berkhout, who's Professor of Environment, Society and Climate here at King's. Frans, welcome.
Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Indeed. And Anastasia Piliavsky teaches anthropology and politics also here at King's. Anastasia, welcome to you.
Thank you.
Teyah Payne is a PhD candidate in geography here at King's College London, and her primary research interest is using water science, policy and governance to address water security threats faced by vulnerable communities. Teyah, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's start first with France and, of course, the financial institutions around the world, and these include Bank of America, Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs, have been backing the COP28 goal of tripling capacity for nuclear power by 2050. Now, 14 of the world's biggest banks and financial institutions are pledging to increase their support for nuclear energy. Frans, first of all, I don't want to sound cynical, but this sounds, you have to almost ask yourself the question, what's in it for banks and nuclear energy?
It's a very good question, actually, because certainly Western private banks have not been terribly interested in investing in nuclear power for really quite a long time. And the main reason for that is that nuclear power is very expensive. It also has all sorts of political, reputational issues with it. And then there are a whole range of environmental and security questions about nuclear energy, the nuclear fuel cycle, and so on. And so for a very long time, actually, certainly in Europe, in North America, banks have not been terribly interested in investing. I think the context here is this pledge last December at COP28. COP is the big annual conference on climate policy, international policy, where many countries backed a call for a tripling of nuclear capacity globally. And a couple of weeks ago, there was quite a large conference in Sweden to follow up on that. And it was as a result of that there was a statement in New York last week by this range of very influential banks. So that is really quite a change, I think, in terms of their attitude, and interesting to work out why that might be.
And in practical terms, how will this financing work?
Well, one of the great difficulties for nuclear power is, not just that it's controversial, it's very difficult to site nuclear power plants, certainly in Europe or North America. You broadly have to do it at existing nuclear power plant sites. It's very difficult to open new ones. But the price of power from a nuclear reactor is far more expensive. And so electricity generated by nuclear reactors is probably 3 to 4 times as expensive as electricity generated from renewables, from wind farms or from solar. 4 times more expensive. And that means, in fact, that consumers and governments need to subsidize or create regulatory systems that allow investors like banks to recuperate their large investment, which has to happen up front mainly, over the 40 or maybe longer year life of a nuclear reactor. So the way this is all going to be conditioned is that rules will need to be written that allow banks to be secure in recouping a very large investment that they would need to make in new nuclear reactors. And most of those are in fact likely to be in Asia and possibly in other parts of the world, but primarily in Asia. The major reactor building programs today are in China and likely to be so for some time. Of course, China is the biggest emitter by far of carbon into the atmosphere. A lot of that comes from coal, electricity generation, and it's the replacement of that coal by renewables, by the Chinese, and by nuclear. To a large extent, this is a Chinese story, but because of the significance of Chinese emissions on a global scale, it is a very important development, I think.
Right. But also, I mean, if we focus slightly on the Chinese and say that they are the world's biggest polluters, yet we do know that they're very reticent to make the transition to cleaner fuel. That being the case, and if they're the largest polluters, is there an argument to be made to say that then this is just basically a way of saying, we're doing our best to change the situation, but then everyone knows, including the banks, that it's not something that's going to succeed. So they might as well, append their name to something that looks good in the first place.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that, Esau. I think you're being a little bit unfair there to the Chinese. I mean, the Chinese are by far the largest investors in renewables and, are technological leaders in areas like solar. Let me just give you some numbers just to give a sort of context. The total size of the UK electricity power system is 70 gigawatts. 70 gigawatts. Last year, the Chinese installed about 270 gigawatts of renewable power. So in 1 year, they installed more than 3 times the size of the total UK power system in renewables. Now, of course, they're an enormous country, and they can do this because they have capital, they're investing in it, and so on. But the Chinese are really the world leaders in renewables and in renewable capacity and in many renewable technologies as well. And in fact, the fact that Chinese policy has been so successful is part of the reason why in 2024, likely, we will have a historic moment where there's in fact peaking of global carbon emissions. It's really what the Chinese are doing that is determining. So in a sense, the climate we get in the future globally will be the climate as a result of the Chinese and the Americans, because they're the second largest, provide for us. And so we should be cheering on from the sidelines. Obviously, we should be doing our work in the UK, in Europe, and other parts of the world, but it's really those two dominant motors, those engines of carbon mitigation that are crucial. And this is going to require not just government regulation and government finance, the taxpayer, the consumer. It's also going to require huge quantities of private investment, whether in renewables, in storage, in carbon capture and storage, or in nuclear, in order for that to happen. And therefore, banks are absolutely crucial to that transition.
And just very briefly, Professor Berkhout, just to the ordinary man and woman on the street, when we talk nuclear, one thinks obviously of weaponry and war and destruction. But this is a different kind of nuclear we're talking about.
Well, nuclear fission reactors, as they're known, have been around in the world for about 70 years. I mean, it's a very old-fashioned technology in that sense. Many of the problems associated with nuclear haven't really been resolved either. There are still some questions about safety. There are clearly issues to do with what to do with the wastes. In no country in the world have we yet in 60, 70 years found a way of dealing particularly with high-level wastes, spent fuel and so on. And there is also, as you allude to, always the remaining question of the proliferation of nuclear weapons, because the materials used in power reactors, uranium transformed into plutonium, highly enriched uranium, is one of the materials you can build nuclear weapons with, as is plutonium. And so there's always going to be an association there between civil nuclear power and the potential for nuclear weapons. Now, it's not straightforward to do that. You need to be pretty sophisticated and invest very heavily, as the Iranians and others are finding out. But, if countries like North Korea can build nuclear weapons, then in principle, it's something that many countries would be able to do if you have large-scale nuclear programs in many, many different countries. International safeguards regimes exist, but, the question is whether they'd be efficient in all countries. So the basic problems associated with nuclear power, cost, safety, the waste, proliferation, are the same today as they were 50 years ago, and we've not really resolved any of them comprehensively.
您正在收听
You are listening to The World We Got This podcast.
Let's go now to India-US relations. And the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been in the United States. It's his first visit since he was re-elected. He signed a lot of agreements with the Americans, including a semiconductor pact, and met with CEOs of top tech companies in the United States. Now, Dr. Anastasia, remind us, how important is this relationship for both countries?
So over the last 10 years, India and the United States have really upped their strategic partnership. There's a lot of development on the military front. The biggest thing that Modi really promising to do on this trip is buy $3 billion worth of drones from the Americans, multi-use. So the cooperation in the Indo-Pacific is expanding. So as American eyes turn to China, and with Russia weakened by its war against Ukraine, China has now risen on the horizon as it's sort of inscribed in the American strategic documents of all kinds as the strategic opponent. Of course, the American side is very interested in cultivating its strategic partnership with India, and it was really the Americans who initiated that strategic partnership and its expansion 10 years ago.
Now, can the Americans play it both ways? In fact, does it serve their interest to do so, to engage both China? You just mentioned China seen from Washington as an opponent, but does it behoove them to engage both China and India?
Well, they are playing a double game in terms of, they're very heavily dependent on China in terms of trade, economically, industrially dependent on China. And are they playing China against India? I don't actually think so. I think the player here is India, because what has happened over the last year and a bit is that quietly the relationship between India and China has shifted very, very dramatically. And this really hasn't made it into the press. In the press, we hear that China is India's strategic foe, that we hear about the clashes on the border that happened in 2020 and 2021. But what has really happened since 2020 and 2021 is that clashes on the Indo-Chinese border have been 5 of the 7 hotspots have reached a solution on the level of generals. So that is going towards a rather amicable solution. And quietly last year, China has superseded the United States as India's biggest trade partner. Early this year, the Chinese ambassador, who was since the clashes in 2020, has been away from India, has returned. He's making the rounds of Delhi. India has eased visas for Chinese specialists in infrastructure development, engineers, factory builders, because India is playing a double game. On the one hand, it's growing closer to the US, and that has been sped up, of course, by Russia's war in Ukraine, because India is now in a position where it needs to rapidly move away from Russian military calibers. And it's been moving from 2016, but it's started moving very rapidly from 2022 to NATO weapons. So it really needs America in that sense. But on the other hand, it really needs China to industrialize. And Chinese specialists are being brought in, being sort of cajoled in, being welcomed to build infrastructure, to build factories, which under current climate change circumstances, Modi desperately, both in terms of India's actual future and politically for himself, really needs to industrialize the country.
And if, as you say, India is the one that's sort of doing the playing in this relationship in terms of benefiting more than, say, the Chinese. India and China are both members of the BRICS group. How does then that relationship play out within that organization?
Well, that really does help with the trade relations that have been burgeoning. What's really extraordinary about Modi's game, which I think is very clever, is that he has used BRICS as a platform to develop the trade partnership with China. And that expansion of the trade partnership, of trade relations, is actually also serving the purpose of a security buffer. So if we look back at the parallel with Russia and Ukraine before 2014 was safer from Russia precisely because a lot of Russian business was inside Ukraine. So bombing Ukraine wasn't very profitable for the wealthier class. I think Modi's trying to do the same with China. The more Chinese business interest there will be, the more secure I think India will feel. So that's the game that I think the Americans aren't. I'm not sure how well they're seeing that.
All right. Thank you very much, Anastasia Piliavsky. We will come back to you towards the end again.
Słuchacie?
Du hörst.
您正在收听
You are listening to The World We Got This podcast.
Welcome back. And we're going to talk about flooding. And the month of September has seen record-breaking floods across parts of Europe, Africa, and Asia. Hurricanes and heavy rains have left towns and cities submerged, killed hundreds, and triggered a mass displacement of people. Typhoon Yagi, for example, which swept through Vietnam, Laos, Thailand, and Myanmar, killed well over 500 people. And we just heard in the news just in the last few days that floods in the United States also have been responsible for the deaths of hundreds of people. So let's turn to Teyah Payne. And Teyah, you are an expert in climate change. You're also doing this governance of water. First of all, in terms of it being able to be available to people in parts of the world, actually parts of the world where you least think that there'd be water shortages, i.e. the West. Explain that for us. How is that even the case that we've got problems with people in countries that are supposedly more influential and powerful and wealthy?
Thank you for asking that, because this is something I'm very personally passionate about. So my family is actually from Virginia and Florida, which are two hot spots for flooding in the United States. And my extended family also used to live in Mississippi as well, and Louisiana. So I have a lot of personal experiences with hurricanes, particularly. Hurricane Katrina was a very devastating moment for my family. Hurricane right now, Hurricane Helene going on. My family's dealing with that right now. Flooding is a huge, huge problem in the United States, and water security, i.e. having full-term access, year-long access to quality water, is a problem in the United States. My secondary supervisor, Katie Meehan, actually published a couple years ago a plumbing poverty report, which used U.S. Census data to demonstrate that millions of Americans are facing poverty in terms of their access to sanitation. And so these issues tend to be framed as something that is really far apart in, the global south in terms of the global north. But the parallels between security in terms of water that you see in the global south of, certain vulnerable populations repeat themselves in the global north as well, particularly in countries where I'm from, like the United States, that have high inequality. The United States has one of the highest Gini indexes of the entire global north. I think the highest, if I'm correct. And that has a huge impact on people being able to access water. Part of my work is trying to educate people on the realities that water security is not just something that is for traditionally labeled poorer countries, if that makes sense.
What does climate change also have to do with all of this?
Climate change plays a huge role. So the World Weather Attribution Organization, which has partners with UCL, recently found that, which we all kind of know, that since industrialization, the global climate temperature has increased 1.3 degrees since the beginning of industrialization. And when you have warmer climate, you have warmer air, and warmer air, that means more moisture, and more moisture means more rain. And I'm relating this directly to flooding particularly. And the more rain you have, obviously the more flooding you're going to have, and the more hurricanes you're going to have, the more typhoons you're going to have, because heat brings energy, and the more energy, these kind of events that could be really rare become very normal. And unfortunately, at the moment, we do not have, and this is not just the global south issue, this is also a global north issue, our infrastructure to deal with the increased occurrences of these types of weather events, which are all not only going to be more frequent, but also more devastating. The likeliness of how damaging they can be is going to be higher. The infrastructure in terms of not just physical infrastructure, like, how cities are built or how urban areas are built, but also the financial infrastructure to deal with, helping communities out is not resilient enough in terms of what we're going to be facing in the long term.
And, we're obviously working hard to cut carbon emissions. What can we do about flooding? Or is this a case that Mother Nature just has to take her course?
There's a lot we can do about flooding, actually. That's why I do the work I do. I think most of my colleagues would agree that there's plenty of solutions. Even to talk about, Central and Eastern Europe, as we know, September was a very, very, very devastating month in terms of flooding, particularly on the Polish-Czech border and Austria. Although the kind of news stories right now are very, very focusing on the devastation, which I think is kind of interesting, is that in 2002, a very similar situation happened in the same area, and the death toll was a lot higher. I think over 200 people died in 2002 from the same kinds of flooding. But this year, a lot less people died. The reason why the death toll was lower is because there was infrastructure put in place, because there was an acknowledgement that, okay, flooding will increase, so we need to have more flood resilient policies in place, right? And so it was addressed in 2002, and it's not, and the impacts are not as devastating as they were the last time. But in general, I think that we still are not doing enough. I think that a lot of research has shown there are more vulnerable groups to flooding than others. So we do need to just acknowledge the fact that there needs to be more investment and more acknowledgement by everybody that we're going to have more climate related events. Information is a huge one. Knowledge and discouraging people to live in flood zones is a good one. I'm from Florida, so Miami is a huge problem. We have sprawling cities. Discouraging people from doing that is a big one. But also, creating faster responses to flood issues as well, I think would be important.
How do you set about doing that, Teyah, when people love their lakeside properties?
Yeah, I agree. So, port cities, beachfront communities, tourism is always going to be kind of a huge thing to kind of fight off, right? I'm from Florida, so I definitely understand the frustration of this. I completely understand that. But part of it, I think there was some research done recently. I can't recall the researchers, but on flood insurance. So, huge thing is that places in Europe, for example, that have higher premiums for flood insurance have less people moving to flood risk areas, right? So kind of doing like demand for these kind of properties, curbing that, creating barriers politically as well for people to move in these areas. Because at the end of the day, we do have a global issue of reducing climate change in terms of the warming climate. That's going to be, we all know how difficult it's been to get that addressed in the way that it should be to cause less damage. But contextually, countries can put in place, kind of discouraging people to live in those places. And I know that's frustrating, but again, I think younger populations are more understanding of this, I would argue. I think it's an easier sell to a Gen Z than I guess, a Gen Xer, you know what I mean? But kind of just the more you educate and the more you emphasize the importance of the danger, I think that could also play a role, if that makes sense. But obviously it's not a perfect solution.
And I just wonder, just briefly, what your take is or what you make of the fact that this question, do you think the world just has to come to terms with the fact that poorer countries are going to have more people die from the effects of climate change? I mean, take a country like Bangladesh, for example. It's one of the wettest countries on earth. People die there every rainy season.
I personally can't accept that. Bangladesh is nowhere near as responsible as the UK or America. You know what I mean? And so I think that countries who've been the primary beneficiaries of the status quo in terms of that has led us to this should be the most responsible in getting us out of it. Because part of the reason of the global south, particularly in flooding, is more vulnerable is because there's a rapid urban expansion replicated similar to how the global north has expanded historically. There's rapid urban expansion that is in flood zones, these same places like we talked about, beachfronts, those kinds of towns, those kind of ideal properties. They're replicating those historical things that we've done to gain wealth and influence. And I'm not sure what the perfect solution is, but I don't think we should ever normalize or accept that the countries who have historically done the least to get us here should be the ones who suffer the most, which is the current system at the moment.
Thank you very much, Teyah, for that. And just before we go, well, since I'm still with you, Teyah, just remind us, what are you going to be watching in terms of trends over the next couple of weeks?
I think the infrastructure that's going to be in place, or the kind of the policies in response to the flooding in Central Europe, and just the news in general, how the rebuild's going to be and how important people find it to be, because I think water literacy is a huge thing that we need more focus on. So things like that.
All right, thank you. And Dr. Anastasia Piliavsky, you're watching, I'm sure, keeping your eyes peeled on India and the politics of Modi. What are you going to be keeping your eye on over the next few days and weeks?
Well, I will be looking at legislation related to climate change, which is extremely politically significant for Modi, very much personally so, because 2/3 of India lives in the countryside, and the countryside is what voted against, are the people who voted against Modi, giving him this extremely weak victory. He lost 1/3 of the parliament and had to form a coalition. So he is going to have to do a lot of footwork to, on the one hand, create policy that challenges climate change that has driven the countryside to desperation, and on the other hand, to industrialize the country, to give those farmers who are committing suicides, who are suffering from droughts and failing monsoons, to give them jobs. We also have a situation where India is predicted to be one of the very first countries to, within this decade, to have temperatures that are humanly unbearable for a human being, hiding outside in shade. So there will simply, it's not just a matter of giving jobs and an economic problem. There simply will need to be a lot more workplaces that are cool enough to exist in. So Modi is working really hard on creating policy, and he's working on the 100-day promise and that was part of his mandate on which he created this third government.
And Frans Berkhout, what will you be watching?
As I said earlier, what I will be watching this year is whether there is this peaking of carbon emissions. I think that's a historically very important moment for us. Obviously, we'll all be looking forward to COP29, so this year's Conference of the Parties of the Treaty, the Climate Treaty, which will be in Baku in Azerbaijan, what comes out of that. But in the opposite direction, I think what I'm also fascinated about is the growing political opposition to the energy transition. So we've just seen the largest party in Austria. The leader talks about climate communism. Similar thing in Holland, the election last year actually won by a far-right party. In France, a similar thing could happen if Mr. Trump becomes president. He will roll back a lot of the Biden legislative agenda on climate. So while all of this is going on and will probably continue, there's also a huge amount of public anger about it and affecting the way in which particularly right-wing parties are positioning themselves. So watching that unfold in the coming years will also be fascinating.
Very good. Okay, that's Frans Berkhout. He's Professor of Environment, Society and Climate. And before him, you heard Anastasia Piliavsky, who teaches anthropology and politics. And before her, Teyah Payne, who's a PhD candidate in geography. They're all from King's College here in London, from where this podcast emanated. My name is Esau Williams, and from the School of Global Affairs, thank you for the privilege of your company, and we'll see you next time.